Christopher, you say that wanting to become a violin maker hit you in your teens.
Well, I guess that's because I had exposure through my father's workshop. I just somehow found myself down there, and I always enjoyed the time, and I could while away hours making things with my hands. And then later on, as a teenager, I started playing the guitar and the violin, and somehow I managed to put the two together and made a career out of it.
Christopher, tell me about your schooling.
Well, I moved to Chicago and did a formal apprenticeship as a violin maker, which means spending 4 years' time learning how to make violins and violas and cellos by scratch. And then after I finished my 4-year training, I went to work for 2 dealers of rare violins in Chicago, and I did repair and restoration work. After about 10 years of experience, I felt like I was ready to start on my own.
Right. What kind of clients do you serve?
Well, generally I work with serious students and professional musicians. Since I make a violin by hand, it takes a very long time to complete, and it really wouldn't be suitable for someone who is just beginning.
And how long does it take you generally to make one?
I would say between 150 to 200 hours of work.
You make standard pieces and custom pieces for specific clients. What's the difference?
Well, there are certain models or patterns of stringed instruments that I personally like a lot. Now, you've probably heard the name of Stradivari.
Of course.
There were other famous makers like Guarneri. These are all the old Italian makers who are considered the best makers of all time. And those are the makers that I derive most of my inspiration from. And so I have patterns by those makers that I make myself. Some musicians may like a different model or a different pattern which would give a different sound. So I do custom instruments for specific needs other than the ones that I generally make.
Do they try some of your instruments before you attempt to start on theirs?
Many times I'll have an instrument which I've made which is available for trial, and a musician can try it and maybe respond saying that they like one particular aspect of the sound, but maybe there's another area that they would like a little more attention given to.
So that it's a real rapport between the two of you.
Definitely. It's 2 people working together because they're the one that are going to be making the music. Right. So my job is to try to make them as comfortable as possible with the instrument, and that they can also produce the widest range of sounds as possible.
Christopher invited Julia Lee, a student at the Curtis Institute of Music, to play one of his custom violins for us. How important is it that you have a violin made especially for you?
The way I play is very different from how anyone else would play, and having a violin custom made would reflect some of my taste and what I like in a violin.
Well, are you going to show me some of the techniques you go through here?
Sure.
So you start with the raw wood. Where do you get your wood, and what kind? Most
of the wood comes from Europe. The maple is grown primarily in Bosnia, up in the mountains, and the spruce mostly comes from the Italian Alps. So it's cut from a very high altitude, brought down, and it's air dried for a minimum of 5 years before it's used.
5 years?
At least 5 years, often longer.
So how do you know when it's ready to use?
Well, I can test the relative humidity of the piece, and I want to make sure that it's dry enough to begin carving. It has to be no more than 6% relative humidity before I start. And I also will, tap the wood to hear the resonance and the tones which come out of it. And I also weigh the wood. So there's a few different tests that I'll perform on the wood before I even begin carving. So this is a piece of maple which is going to become a back for the violin. The sides, which are attached to a mold or a form here, are the same wood. It's also maple. These are cut into thin strips, and they're planed even thinner so you can see that they're quite flexible, and they're bent over a hot iron with steam and then attached to these internal blocks and shaped around this mold. And then after this is complete, then I can take the outline from this form and transfer it to the piece which will become the back and begin carving it, which is going to look like this pattern here, where it's been arched with gouges and planes. So this is the raw material for a violin neck block. It's a piece of maple, just like the back and the sides that we talked about. And from this piece of wood, I can apply the pattern or the model that I'm going to be making, and then cut that out on a saw, and I wind up with a piece that's shaped like this. Now the tops are made out of a different wood. They are made out of spruce, and this is just the blank, the raw material that comes from a spruce tree, an Italian spruce. And this block is a wedge-shaped piece. It has two halves. One are like a mirror reflection of the other. I'll open this piece up. I will take the two pieces and I'll plane a glue joint and I'll glue them together, and I'll have the material for my top. And then this will also be cut out to the shape of my mold and my rib assembly. So Suzanne, I really appreciate you coming to my studio to interview me and asking me to participate. So I'd like to ask you to participate a little bit in the making of this violin.
I can't imagine it, but I'd love it.
I started arching this back plate, which means I've cut the rough shape with a gouge. Now the next step is to take these planes and carve the wood to the contours here.
I'll try anything. Ooh, it's hard. My God, this person's going to have a rough violin. All right, now when you finish this, then what happens?
Well, I have to glue all of the parts together. So
Right.
the back and the top and the ribs and the neck are all assembled and glued. And we wind up with an instrument which has all of the parts finished and assembled, but it doesn't have the varnish. But this is where the real magic begins. It's like priming a canvas, painting, and then getting ready to put the real paint on. So the varnish is a very important step, and it takes a long time. And you can't just go down to a hardware store and buy a can of varnish.
Right.
These are very old recipes which have been in existence for hundreds of years, and I use very traditional materials like the resin from pine trees. I also make a very traditional varnish out of amber, which is a fossil resin. It's about 5 million years old. And so that's what I've used on this instrument. You can see the difference in color between the white wood and then the varnished instrument. It actually enhances the look of the wood, and it also improves the sound. The last aspect is called the setup, and those are the parts which have the greatest effect in producing a particular sound. So I have to cut a bridge, and this is the bridge here. Then of course we have the pegs that the strings are tuned to, and the fingerboard and the tailpiece. So these are like the finishing touches that go into the final stages of making sound out of the instrument.
Incredible. What made you decide to make violins rather than other instruments?
Well, I've always considered the violin to be the king of musical instruments. And if you've ever heard a wonderful violinist play, you'll know what incredible expression can be reproduced on such a small little wooden box that weighs less than 2 pounds.
Right.
So the violin, I think, is also the most like the human voice, and with a great musician, the most sublime sounds can be created, and that's an inspiration to me, to hear great music.